In the year 2001, space was still the exclusive domain of governments. It was a place for elite test pilots, brilliant scientists, and career astronauts, men and women handpicked by powerful nations representing the pinnacle of human achievement. The idea of an ordinary citizen simply buying a ticket to orbit was pure science fiction. But one man, a 60-year-old former rocket scientist turned financial tycoon, had a different vision. He had a lifelong dream, and he had the $20 million to make it happen. But his dream would spark an international incident, pitting the world's two greatest space powers against each other. NASA would call him a safety threat, an unwelcome intruder, and a distraction. They would publicly condemn his mission and, in a dramatic confrontation, physically bar him from their training facilities. This is the story of Dennis Tito, the man who refused to take no for an answer. It's the story of a bitter fight, a stubborn dream, and the single flight that kicked open the door to the commercial space age, forever changing who is allowed to touch the stars. The rocket scientist who left NASA. The story of the first space tourist doesn't begin with a billionaire writing a check. It begins decades earlier with a young boy from Queens, New York, staring up at the night sky, captivated by the dawn of the space race. Dennis Tito was born in 1940, and his childhood was set against the backdrop of Sputnik, Yuri Gagarin, and the Apollo program. He was part of a generation that saw humanity take its first tentative steps off the planet, and it ignited a lifelong passion. He wasn't just a dreamer, he was brilliant. Tito earned a degree in astronautics and aeronautics from New York University, and a master's in engineering science. By the age of 23, he was living his dream, working as an aerospace engineer at NASA's prestigious Jet Propulsion Laboratory. In the 1960s, while the world watched the race to the moon, Tito was behind the scenes, performing the complex calculations that were essential to space exploration. He was one of the minds responsible for designing the trajectories for the Mariner spacecraft missions, the robotic pioneers that gave humanity its first close-up views of Mars and Venus. He was, by every definition, a rocket scientist. But as the Apollo era wound down, Tito saw a different frontier opening up, not in the cosmos, but in the world of finance. In 1972, he left JPL and founded his own company, Wilshire Associates. He brought his unique mind, the mind of an aerospace engineer, to the complexities of the stock market. He pioneered a new field called quantitative analytics, applying the same rigorous mathematical techniques he used to plot a spacecraft's path through the solar system to analyze market risks. His company developed the Wilshire 5000, a groundbreaking stock index that became a benchmark for the entire U.S. market. He had traded calculating orbits for calculating portfolios, and in doing so, built a financial empire that managed trillions of dollars in assets. Yet, despite his incredible success on Earth, he never stopped looking at the stars. The dream he had as a boy, the dream of flying in space, never faded. As the new millennium approached, Tito was turning 60. He looked at the history of spaceflight and saw a sobering reality. The oldest rookie astronaut to fly was Deke Slayton, who was 51 on his first mission. Tito felt he was getting over the hill. He knew that if he was ever going to achieve his lifelong goal, it was now or never. A dream derailed. In June of 2000, it seemed his dream was finally within reach. He signed a deal with Mir Corp, a private company that was leasing Russia's aging Mir space station. For a reported $20 million, Tito would fly on a Russian Soyuz rocket and spend a week aboard the legendary orbital outpost. He immediately began the arduous training process at the Yuri Gagarin Cosmonaut Training Center in Star City, Russia, a place steeped in the history of the Soviet space program. But just as quickly as it came together, the dream fell apart. In December 2000, the Russian government, facing mounting costs and safety concerns, announced that Mir would be deorbited. In March 2001, the historic station burned up in a controlled re-entry over the Pacific Ocean. Tito's destination was gone. His flight was canceled. Undeterred, Tito and his partners at the space tourism firm Space Adventures pivoted. There was a new station in orbit, the International Space Station, the ISS. It was a massive multi-billion-dollar collaboration between several nations, with the United States and Russia as the primary partners. The Russians, still in need of cash to fund their space program, agreed to the new plan. They would fly Tito to the ISS on a taxi mission, a flight designed to deliver a fresh Soyuz spacecraft to the station to serve as a lifeboat for the resident crew. The Russians were on board. Dennis Tito was on board. But there was one major problem: NASA. And they were furious. The International Incident. The American Space Agency was vehemently opposed to the idea. The head of NASA at the time, Administrator Daniel Goldin, publicly criticized the plan, stating it was inappropriate for a tourist to ride into space. NASA's official position was that the ISS, still in a complex and critical phase of its assembly, was no place for a non-professional. They argued that Tito was insufficiently trained, that he would be unable to assist in an emergency, and that his presence would require constant supervision, placing an unacceptable burden on the professional astronaut crew. Mike Hawes, a senior station manager at NASA, stated bluntly that Tito's presence would make nominal operations untenable and emergency operations even more dangerous. The international partners from Europe, Canada, and Japan sided with NASA, unanimously opposing Tito's flight. The Russians, however, held firm. They argued that Tito was, in fact, adequately trained on the Russian segment of the station, where he would be spending his time, and that they had the unilateral right to decide who flew in their Soyuz capsules. The conflict came to a dramatic head in March 2001. Dennis Tito, along with his two Russian crewmates, Commander Talgat Musabayev and flight engineer Yuri Baturin, arrived at the Johnson Space Center in Houston for required pre-flight training on the American portion of the station. What happened next was unprecedented. As the crew, including Tito, prepared to enter the training facility, they were met by NASA manager and former astronaut Robert Cabana. In a tense confrontation, Cabana informed the group that they would not be allowed to train together. He stated NASA's position directly to Tito. The NASA position is still, "We do not think there is adequate time to train you for an April flight." He then delivered the final blow. "In that case, we will not be able to begin training because we are not willing to train with Dennis Tito." NASA had physically barred a paying customer and his professional crew from a training facility. The Russian cosmonauts, showing incredible loyalty, refused to enter without him. Commander Musabayev addressed Tito in English. "Denny, we are together. We have to be staying together. Understand?" The crew turned around and left. The standoff had escalated into a full-blown international incident, a crisis of partnership in orbit, all centered on one man's dream: the reluctant agreement. For weeks, the stalemate continued. NASA officials told Congress that Tito's flight was putting incredible stress on the men and women of NASA. They suggested the true cost to the agency, factoring in lost research time and extra safety measures, could be more than the $20 million Tito had paid Russia. Behind the scenes, diplomatic pressure was immense. NASA proposed that Tito postpone his flight until October, giving them more time to establish official criteria for non-professional space flyers and to get him the training they felt he needed. But Tito was adamant. He was 60 years old and had a business to run. He had been training for months. He insisted on the April flight. Ultimately, NASA blinked. faced with Russia's unwavering commitment to the launch and mounting pressure from space commercialization advocates, the agency reluctantly backed down. A task force was assembled, liability waivers were signed, and a set of strict rules was put in place. Tito would be largely confined to the Russian segment of the station and would have to be escorted by a professional astronaut if he entered the American modules. He had won. The dream was back on. On April 28, 2001, 40 years to the month after Yuri Gagarin's historic flight, Dennis Tito strapped into the cramped Soyuz TM-32 capsule at the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. Alongside his crewmates Musabayev and Baturin, he was propelled into orbit by the thunderous power of a Soyuz-U rocket. 2 days later, their spacecraft successfully docked with the International Space Station. When the hatch opened and Dennis Tito floated into the orbiting laboratory, he wasn't just a millionaire on an expensive vacation. He was the living embodiment of a paradigm shift. He had proven that space was no longer the exclusive property of governments. With enough determination and enough money, the final frontier was now open for business. The revolution. Dennis Tito spent nearly 8 days in orbit, circling the Earth 128 times. Far from being the disruptive burden NASA had feared, he adapted quickly and comfortably to life in zero gravity. "One does not have to be superhuman to adapt to space," he later said. "It's very doable. I feel great. I have no feeling of space sickness." He spent his time in awe, gazing out of the station's windows at the Earth below, a sight previously reserved for a select few hundred people in all of human history. He later joked that he wore a big dumb grin the whole week. He also performed several scientific experiments for his company, putting his time in orbit to productive use. He had objected to the term space tourist, preferring spaceflight participant, and he was determined to prove he was more than just a passenger. On May 6, 2001, Tito and the Russian cosmonauts returned to Earth, their Soyuz TM-31 capsule landing safely under parachute on the vast open steppes of Kazakhstan. He had done it. He had fulfilled the dream that had driven him since he was a boy.